Hi, Ted Morrissey here, making a video for my writing students. Um, in this video, I want to sing the praises of the short form. And I've had this idea in mind for quite a while, largely from working with both undergraduates who are majoring in creative writing and with graduate students who are getting their MFAs in writing. And I've kind of noticed this trend in recent years of a lot of students being interested right off the bat in long form projects. For fiction writers, obviously, we'd be talking about novels. For poets, talking about whole collections around a sort of theme of some sort. I suppose playwrights, thinking in terms of whole 5-act plays, etc. And on the one hand, that's great. I think, obviously that kind of ambition is to be applauded. But I get the sense that a lot of students are kind of leapfrogging over the short form. And for, I don't know, centuries, whatever the right time frame is, there had been sort of this understood progression that fiction writers, for example, would first master the short story form before going on and tackling the novel. Because a novel, for instance, is basically a series of short stories, right? I mean, we call them chapters, or we might use other kind of terms, but basically it's pretty, self-contained narrative units. And we can look at each chapter as having a sort of conflict and resolution within it. Think about some of your favorite novels and think about how they're carved up. And I think you'll tend to see that each chapter, each section, again, however the author ultimately organized it, has a sort of narrative integrity. Again, we're introduced to characters. We have some sort of subplot that develops. Hang on, got to pause. So again, we have a sort of subplot that is developed or something like that. And again, if we look at in other genre, if we look at poetry, talking whole collections around a theme rather than just focusing on a single poem to develop and so forth, right? And consequently, seeing writers, poets, playwrights, etc., who seem to sort of be skipping over that short form step, mastering the short form, have a tendency to write these bigger bunches of words that, quite honestly, they don't seem to have a lot of narrative integrity. We just have a whole mass of characters thrown at us. We have, allusions to different plot developments without really any actual development. We have a tendency to have scenes that are very brief and really don't fully develop the idea that seems to be focused on. Similarly, we might have collections of poems where there is a sort of thematic unity to them, but maybe each individual poem isn't perhaps as strong as it might be if the effort was just put on that particular poem. And maybe there are some poems included in that in order to flesh out a whole collection that aren't as dynamic, as interesting, etc., as what other poems in the collection may be. And again, in terms of a full play, a full screenplay, I think a lot of the parallels we can talk about in terms of novels, where again we're introduced to just a whole host of characters. There's all kinds of things happening, but why they're happening and the logic behind them isn't necessarily crystal clear and so forth. So I want to suggest that while having these big projects in mind, wanting to write a whole novel, wanting to put together a whole collection of poems, 80 poems or whatever it might be, write a full play, a full screenplay. That's all great to have those ambitions, but I really do think it's important to make sure we have mastered the short form first. Again, for novelists, I think it's very difficult to be a successful novelist if you haven't mastered the craft of writing a short story. Again, it's hard to write a collection of poems that are all strong and vibrant and dynamic if we haven't sort of mastered the individual poem. I know Juan Felipe Herrera, the great poet, writer, teacher, U.S. poet laureate for a time, who I had the good fortune of being a student of his. He talked about that he thought it was a real shame that in the kind of the 80s, et cetera, that there was this emphasis for poets on the collection, that to be a serious poet, you had to be writing some sort of thematic collection. And he said that that really was a detriment to poetry in general, because there was a time where poets wrote poems. They just focused on writing an individual poem and made it as good as it could be. They weren't mindful of it being part of some holistic project and therefore be thinking big picture without fully focused on the small picture, the individual poem. And so Juan Felipe talked about how poets should get back to just writing good poems one at a time, and then eventually, if you can kind of amass them into some sort of collection, then all the better, perhaps. But the important thing is to focus on the individual poem. And again, I think for a playwright, a similar sort of strategy would be to focus on the one act play, for instance, and really master the craft of the one act play before trying to write 5 acts or whatever, a full play. And for the filmmaker and the scriptwriter, rather than trying to do a feature length film right out of the gate, focus on the short, right? I think anyone who's into film knows that a lot of great directors, maybe all great directors, for a time did short films, right? And then when they mastered the craft of the short film, all the various entities that go into that, the different elements that go into that, then expanding out into the long form feature length film, right? So that would be my advice. The theme of these videos has been, what to think about once we get past the thesis, once we get our MFA in hand, what do we do next? And I'm going to suggest that for a lot of students, they may want to take a step back. That if they've been really focused on writing a novel, that they take a step back and make sure that they're writing really good quality short stories that are being accepted for publication, hopefully by some pretty nice places, and get to the point where they feel very comfortable writing a successful and effective short story, and then looking at how you weave those together, in the form of perhaps chapters, et cetera, into a whole novel. Again, poets, instead of thinking about, the whole collection thematically organized, just focus on writing one really good poem after another, right? And if they're connected somehow thematically, well, that's fine. But if they're not, that's also fine, because the focus should be on the individual poem. Again, playwrights, script writers for film focus on short, material, and master that before really spending time and energy, years perhaps, on a big project. I suppose in terms of nonfiction writers, creative nonfiction, the equivalent would be to focus on the small, kind of self-contained essay, as opposed to a collection of essays that are somehow related. Or if we're memoir writers, writing autobiography, I think the parallels with the short story novelists are very, very true, that we should focus on small autobiographical units that have their own kind of narrative integrity, master that, and then perhaps look at a long form memoir or string together these individual autobiographical pieces. But I think to try to jump into the deep end of the pool and try to write a whole novel, a whole memoir, a whole collection of essays, a whole collection of poetry, a feature-length script, a 5-act play, without having mastered the smaller form first is really, really difficult. So that would be some advice to consider. Get through this process, If you're writing a novel, that's fine, or a full length, whatever, that's fine. But once the degree is completed, think about, again, I don't think it's a step back. I think it's really a step forward. It's a step forward in terms of craft and mastery, looking at the short form. Not to mention that if you do eventually want to go to an agent, try to find an agent, go to a larger publisher, showing a long list of publishing credits of these shorter form works, again, whether they're short stories, poems, essays, whatever, will really, show you as a serious writer to be taken seriously, as opposed to someone who doesn't really have a whole lot of credentials in terms of publication credits. All right, I'm going to stop there and give you that to ponder.